This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So now next speaker is Thomas Rath. Thomas is going to talk about authoritarianism and resistance in Mexico.
I need to just get my images up.
Yeah.
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 See, I've given a generic, yes. Right, we were just, that's fine. So, well, thank you all for coming. Again, I'd just like to thank Julio for the invitation to do this. I mean, my basic brief, Julio asked me to talk a little bit about the pamphlet holdings and basically encourage other people to use and explain why they're interesting. For the Mexican collection, which is what I decided to focus on, this is a very easy thing to do. It's not a huge collection. I think the boxes on Brazil, there's many, many more. There's only 3, but there's about 100 items in the Mexican, in those 3 boxes. So it's not a lot, but the contents afford many, many interesting insights, I think, into Mexican politics and society during a fascinating and very controversial period, that is roughly from 1968 to the year 2000. I'm going to show you some images, which I did take using my phone, Anthony, so yes, I can confirm that's a big innovation. I didn't steal anything though, so not yet, although it is very interesting stuff. What I'm going to do is talk about 2 things in particular. I'm mainly going to talk about sort of patterns of dissent and protest, repertoires, if you like, of protest against the regime. And then secondly, I'll talk a little bit about how the government responded to this criticism and dissent. And as I do all of that, I'll show some images and some pictures and suggest some of the ways I think these sort of ephemeral sources in the Mexican collection, but across the pamphlet collection as a whole, can provide some unexpected information and insights. So first, a few words about what's in the boxes themselves, where they come from, and the general context. As far as I know, and Linda just confirmed this for me, the collection were mainly donated by various NGOs and activists who campaigned against political repression, human rights abuses and poverty in Mexico. And so naturally they reflect the kinds of things that they were interested in. There are many government publications, speeches and programs and general descriptive reports written by scholars, social scientists, the US government, which NGOs obviously found useful as sort of background information. Much more compelling generally are the reports, the magazines, the political pamphlets, the cartoons produced by Mexican and also by international social movements, NGOs and solidarity groups. So that's basically what we're talking about. Now, as a historian, as Anthony's talked about, I mean, there's obvious limits to what you can do with this material. For example, there's very little about the different kinds of social movements and mobilization that was happening broadly on the political right in Mexico, which we now recognize as a very important thing that was going on in the Cold War. It's kind of a hot topic in research. So it's not going to tell you about certain things. Nevertheless, it's worth emphasizing that the kinds of things NGOs were interested in are very central to larger interpretations that social scientists and historians posit for this period. The years 1968 to 2000 are usually seen, or have usually been seen, as a time of slow but inexorable democratic transition, as Guillermo was talking about. This is the sort of peculiar, drawn-out Mexican version of what was happening across the region in the 1980s. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, which had ruled Mexico in one form or another through a careful blend of co-optation and repression, gradually lost control of elections and public discussion, and eventually lost the presidency in the year 2000. Now, this is the big story that largely has been written by politólogos, as you say, and the big story is plausible enough, but there's many smaller stories which we don't know about and which I think we need to know about, and I would absolutely agree that these pamphlet collections kind of help us one of the things they do is help us flesh those out. And of course, this big story of transition a la Mexicana raises many, many tricky questions which are very far from settled, either among scholars or in Mexican society. When did and how did the transition start? Was it driven by popular protest, bottom-up pressures, international criticism? The 1968 student movement is a common starting point, but you can easily make the case for other points. It's much debated. Were recurrent economic crises more important? Has the transition ended? Most important of all, I think, if we look at citizenship rights more broadly rather than just elections, in what sense can we really talk about a transition at all now? And obviously the many disappointments of Mexican democracy since the year 2000 are inevitably have shaped and continue to shape how we tell this story. No? So it's a crucial and much debated period, and these sources tell us some important things about it. So what do they tell us about it? Well, one of the things I think the sources illustrate very well, and the first thing I noticed about in terms of repertoires of protest and dissent, is how people drew on their own versions of Mexico's old revolutionary transition in order to criticize the nominally revolutionary state. That's a pattern you see time and time again. Now, in the case of the Zapatistas, the neo-Zapatistas in Chiapas, this is quite well known. It's fairly obvious given their name that that's who they're harking back to. But there are some sort of nice visual examples of this going on. This is what I'm showing you here. This is an iconic image of the original Zapatistas from Morelos coming to Mexico City, having coffee at Sanborns. And this has been taken up by a solidarity group based in Mexico City in 1996. So it's just to show you how that's going on. How do I? There we go. Okay. I think there's many other examples of this I could have showed you. This is probably my favourite. This is a 1970 cartoon from the Marxist cartoonist Rios, in which he offers a playful but basically pretty sincere defence of Lázaro Cárdenas. There's a bit of mockery here, which you might be able to see, but basically it's a very admiring portrait of the great revolutionary reformer president of the 1930s, which makes some very sharp comparisons and contrasts between Cárdenas and his contemporaries and successors. Cárdenas didn't enrich himself egregiously, unlike these other generals down here on the right. And he also took part in serious military engagements rather than, I quote, glorious battles against students. So Rios is not unusual at all. Many other social movements whose materials are in these archives use humour and popular visual idioms to try and get their message across. Another example I just sort of picked out is this 1974 cartoon Avanzando. This was produced by a popular renters association based in Mexico City, and the point of the cartoon is to urge people to join the union and to help address many of the problems caused by rapid, uncoordinated urbanization going on in Mexico City at the time. It tells the story of some peasants who migrate to the city from the countryside with high hopes only to have them dashed by a lack of work and poor living conditions, and it contrasts their fate with that of a complacent middle-class family out in the Lomas. It's, I think, modelled rather like a melodramatic soap opera. The story ends with a cliffhanger, which is this page I'm showing you here, where finally the family decide around the table, we're going to organise, we're going to join the union, and then just as they decide, the landlord and the police arrive to turn them out. So it sort of leaves you on a cliffhanger. I think the main story, and it's interesting, it's a bit dull and didactic. The bizarre image on the back of the magazine compensates for this. This is an image of Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, portrayed as a devil chatting to Hitler in hell, which I like just for its bluntness, basically. If nothing else, looking at Rios' cartoon and also this one, we can see how the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre echoed through the political culture in the following decades and became a point of reference for groups like this Renters Association, whose aims were actually rather different than the original student protest. No? If you like, the 68 massacre becomes part of the repertoire of political dissent, and this is a genealogy, but it's also absolutely something that continues to today. No? So we can trace some of the origins of this. So, The other thing that I think that I found really interesting looking at these pamphlets is, I mean, you can see how Mexicans draw on older revolutionary and radical traditions to criticise and condemn the government, but you also see gradually how they blend this with a newer language and techniques which we usually associate with the international human rights movement, which is on the rise globally in the 1970s. Now, there's numerous things I could have shown you but I think this one pamphlet kind of illustrates it better than anything. This is a pamphlet from 1979, The Trench of the Oppressed. It's published by a group I don't know very much about, based in Cuernavaca, the Popular Front for Human Rights, Constitutional Guarantees and Democratic Liberties. And it illustrates this intermingling of older left and radical traditions with newer, the language of universal human rights very, very well. So it contains the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It issues a call for an international tribunal to try the Mexican government for its abuses. But it also opens with an old anti-fascist wood print created around 1948 by the socialists Taller Gráfica Popular. It has a story of peasants, the ejidatarios, defending their land, which they gained in the revolution, so it's harking back to that old agrarian radicalism as well. And it promotes solidarity with the Nicaraguan Sandinistas at the same time. So in some ways, again, we can see this as a precursor to the Zapatistas, who did much the same thing in conceptual terms. They embrace the cause of universal human rights, but they adapt it and they connect it very much to a larger project of social transformation. So I think the reason I find this particularly interesting is it speaks to larger interpretive questions that are going on in the field of human rights history, which some of you, I'm sure, are aware of. Some accounts of the emergence of human rights activism in the 1970s, Samuel Moynes, for example, tend to portray it as a response to the exhaustion of nationalist or socialist ideas, models of human progress, as a way of focusing on individual abuses rather than larger social problems, social transformations. And for Moynes particularly, very much as an example of a kind of impoverishment of utopian thinking and political imagination, if you like. Now, maybe this interpretation works at the global level, but I think locally on the ground in Latin America, particularly Mexico, these ideas are all mingled together and seen as mutually reinforcing by the groups who are actually promoting them. So that's idea of sort of linear narrative from nationalism, socialism towards human rights. It doesn't work so well in the case of Mexico. Another thing we see is how Mexican social movements fostered organisational links with international groups. This 1968 pamphlet was published by the United States Committee for Justice for Political Prisoners, which was founded in 1966, precisely to foster solidarity with the student movement in Mexico. It's an absolutely fascinating document. It contains a collection of translated testimonies, cartoons, examples of graffiti, student slogans. One of my research interests is the image and public debates about the military in Mexico. So I find these kind of images of soldiers as guerrillas and how they, which are very well known in Mexico, but how they sort of go, they circulate transnationally is very interesting to me. Tucked away inside this pamphlet is a poster of a meeting at Barnard College, which was co-organised it has the list of faculty members who organised it, and the Colombian branch of Students for a Democratic Society. So you can find this sort of information of these links and the people who are involved. Some Zapatista pamphlets as well from the 1990s also contain this sort of unexpected information about this links and networking that you can see. This is a Zapatista diary, which was published in 1996 by an Italian group based in Milan, Ya Basta, a solidarity group with the Sandinistas. So it contains a whole bunch of sort of stock Zapatista imagery, which you could really get anywhere. Most interesting is this, it also has a list of contacts across Europe in the 1990s. So if you're really interested, I guess you could follow some of this stuff up. So it's naturally hard to gauge, one of the problems with this is hard to just on the basis of the archive, you can't really gauge the effect that this has on public opinion or on Mexican politics. But the boxes do contain, I think, a few hints of how the government, how the regime responded to this growing criticism that we see. Party speeches and programs in the boxes provide many examples of the kind of, if you like, the pre-repertoire, which I think is a coherent thing, the particular kind of grandiloquent, vague, euphemistic, vaguely passive-aggressive populist discourse that the pre specialises in. We could call it pre-speak. There's loads of examples of this. I think one example from 1975 pamphlet will suffice, which was translated into English and sent out of the country to bolster the pre's image. Reality is not to be enclosed, imprisoned in formulas. It inevitably eludes them. Our revolution is essentially a moving reality in constant transformation, a group of ideas, but also realities which, driven by forces that sustain them, move of their own accord, and compelling us to think and rethink, they widen the panorama of our essential ideas. Now, this kind of waffle could have been produced at any time really since the 1940s. It's kind of a quintessential example of it. Now, and unless you're a real connoisseur of pre-speak, like me, this stuff soon becomes, there's not that much you can do with it. Nevertheless, there are a few more interesting examples of the government directly acknowledging problems and criticism in the 1970s. Another 1975 pamphlet includes an interview with Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, who was the, vice presidential candidate for the 1976 election, in which he offers, actually, I think, rather a cogent and intelligent defence of pre-led industrial development since the 1940s, acknowledging some of the inevitable costs and problems that this created. In 1988, Muñoz became disillusioned and split from the pre, and one of the founders of the PRD. And I think you can get some sort of sense of that in the earlier speech from the 1970s. The archive also contains numerous reports and publications from what we could say is the main institutional response to grassroots and international human rights activism, which is the official Human Rights Institute founded in 1990, the National Human Rights Commission. Now, in general, this institution and the materials that you find in the boxes, it much better fits the image of human rights activism as kind of depoliticised and meek that Moyne has in mind. But even in these documents, in the institution, the Commission's founding statement, the social and economic rights enshrined in the Constitution of 1917 are recognised as part of their programme of human rights. So at least at the level of theory, they're in there somewhere still. I think more telling for me is these comments in the margins that you can see. We see in several of these reports criticising and questioning the different decisions of the Human Rights Commission. Now, I don't know who left this marginalia, but to me, I'd like to read it as quite a nice illustration of this disjuncture between official human rights institutions and grassroots activism. A final example I'll end with a final example of official propaganda, which on the face of it is again not that interesting. It shows the kind of glossier and less substantive side of government discourse. This is a brochure on Miguel de la Madrid during his it was created in 1982 for his presidential campaign. It combines the usual praise for the president's honesty, his patriotism, his willingness to kind of hang out with indigenous peasants and listen to them. Again, that's a kind of repertoire which goes back to the 1930s in propaganda around presidential campaigns. But there, along with this sort of old images, you get some new things as well, particularly an emphasis on de la Madrid's technocratic expertise honed at Harvard. That's a new ingredient, and that's something that will become increasingly important in Mexican elite politics and propaganda in the 1980s. We also learned that, I quote, Miguel de la Madrid is a self-made man. He has strong roots in Mexican traditions, which have enabled him to become part of the modern world without losing his appreciation for simple things, for what is sincere and authentic. Miguel de la Madrid has never been attracted by wealth or personal business dealings. Now, perhaps the main question raised by this kind of discourse is, who on earth thought anyone would be convinced by it? But one of the things I'll just sort of leave you with is, the great thing about this sort of material is you do sometimes get an answer. So lo and behold, tucked away at the beginning of this pamphlet is a letter telling us who sent this out. It was none other than Carlos Salinas de Gortari, future president, who created and sent out the brochure in 1982 while heading one of the Pri's propaganda arms. So with that I'll end. That's my sort of Carlos Salinas-shaped rabbit that I pulled out of a hat at the end for you. What I hope I've done is given you some sense of the larger issues and themes that these collections can illuminate, and also shown some of the peculiar sorts of information and unexpected insights this apparently ephemeral material can sometimes provide. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Grimaldi, who's going to talk about Brazil and international human rights in 1970s and 1980s.
So, as Avila's just mentioned, I'll be talking about this research, which is essentially my PhD thesis. But I can also, I'll also be talking about the collection a bit more generally. I came here for the first time, I guess, I think the summer of 2014 to volunteer with these boxes when they were kind of a bit jumbled up, and we knew what was inside the boxes, but we didn't know which boxes they were in and stuff like that. So that was the work I did for about a year and a half. We finally finished. But this means I have a bit of a good idea on what's inside them and I guess the other things that they have to offer. So I can answer any questions that you have on the more general collection. So I'll try to start with so some of the things that are in the Brazil boxes, it covers pretty much everything in there really. The church, political parties, we've got food, health campaigns, things like that. So these ones here, I mean, this is one of the things that interests me about these books to the comics. I'm really happy to put those up. This first one here is a similar story to the one Thomas spoke about. It shows a couple or family going to the city to try and find work, and essentially they're also disappointed. So one of the things that this collection does is we see basically the working movement starting from these very simple kind of local comics and eventually moving into the Central Union and then the PC. So we kind of get all the parts of the story through them. Okay, so my own research. The thing that most interested me about what was inside the boxes was not so much the content, and the kind of theme amongst everyone's talk, I guess, but more like what they represented, because they are essentially an evidence of the relationship between Brazil and other countries. These are not just documents that are produced for Brazil themselves, but to communicate ideas overseas, and they also represent the kind of increasing internationality of the question of human rights, and this is what I'd like to look at. The other thing that they do is they kind of move away from the top-down effect. So it sees human rights narrative not just as the legal and political and kind of official discourse, but more from what's happening from down below. So the fact that they're printed on pamphlets and magazines and letters and not in books also shows how there's another narrative going on. And I think it's important that that one starts to get spoken about. So while I've started opening these boxes, some of the things I found is that, as was mentioned during the previous talks, there isn't just this one kind of linear international history of what's happened in the human rights situation in Brazil, but there are actually a few different narratives going on at the same time. And one of these is the workers' rights, and that spoke more to the workers and unions in Brazil. What we understand as social and economic rights was what was taken up by the peasant and indigenous communities. There's a tiny bit of a blur between these two, which is something I'm going to start with, but essentially, yeah, you can see those as two separate things. And then there was the more civil and political rights, which was the struggle for political prisoners under the dictatorship. And what I found whilst looking at these is that each of them has their own different connection to the international movement. They each communicated with different groups on the international level. They each had their own kind of strategies. They each interpreted what human rights was in a slightly different way. And again, this shows that there's not just one kind of narrative for the human rights history. So, moving to the first one. So the worker movement in Brazil, or the human rights kind of struggle in Brazil for the workers, was quite unusual because it worked quite closely with the government. So it kind of had to work within the confines of kind of government standards on human rights. So they didn't necessarily speak about human rights in the international sense because they weren't trying to appeal to the international scene. Rather, they understood rights as kind of obligations for both sides of either the employer or the employee. Which is interesting because sometimes they went forward to like the International Labour Organization, but mostly they kept documents and communication between themselves. And this is one of the boxes. It says the work contract generates rights and obligations for the worker and for the employee. So they're not trying to appeal to kind of any international audience with this. This is just themselves. The peasant and indigenous communities were a bit different. They were connected to the international scene through the church, mostly the Catholic Church. And because of this, I think there was a lot more of the internationally kind of rhetoric on human rights in a lot of their publications. It appealed to people overseas because as Catholics there's this kind of religious kind of need to address these the human rights violations that were going on. And it was also there was also this interesting history going on with the Catholic Church in Brazil at the time. There was something called liberation theology, which kind of created a bit of a debate on the international scene. It challenged what the role of priests really was at the time, and the Vatican was very silent on it for a long time. So I guess this also sparked a lot of attention internationally. This is one document created within the church, and it's about health, essentially. But the interesting thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, there was quite a strong connection with the international understanding of human rights, and they quote that directly. This little article here, or these few verses here, it's essentially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in popular language. So they've directly communicated with the international human rights discourse and translated it to their own citizens, similar to what we were talking about earlier. And as I mentioned earlier, this meant that there was a response from the international scene. So this is a magazine created it takes on the case of Brazil's peasants victims of poverty and violence from land owners, and this was discussed all over Europe. And I guess the third group is the political prisoners. So I think this group out of the three kind of had the strongest connection to the international scene. But this wasn't through the church or anything, this was through, I guess, art and culture and academia. One of the things that happened a lot was that maybe perhaps international students or artists travelling abroad, and mostly famous people, I guess, and that's what kind of caught the attention more of the international scene, rather than for any kind of religious reason people were involved, political or academic reasons in Brazil. So this is an article produced in Geneva about a local leader that had been arrested a few times and they were fearing that he might be killed the next time. We've also got the International Christian Youth Workers. So essentially what's happened here is the International Christian Youth Workers were in Brazil and they were all arrested. The Brazilian ones were all arrested, so the international group overall became interested through that. And this is another one, so this is testimony from the Dominican priest connected to the Dominican priest in London. So I think I've mixed up two of the slides. So, political prisoners. This image that we see here, not from the boxes, but this is Vladimir Herzog, who, as I said, the kind of political prisoner issue was brought to the international attention because of work exchanges, academic exchanges, and this is a perfect example of that. And I think because of that, it also communicated more directly with, like I said, the kind of set discourse of human rights laws. They also had the help of a lot of big charities, so Amnesty International, for example. They were only really interested in prisoners of conscience, so people that had been arrested or were suffering violations of human rights because of their ideas. So obviously this kind of applies more to political prisoners than, say, indigenous populations. So one of the examples was this report on allegations of torture in Brazil, published in 1972. Another one was the Russell Tribunal in 1973. And you can see that, well, you can't see on there, but you can see they had the help of a lot of kind of well-known figures, Chomsky, Pablo Neruda, a lot of these kind of big names that made the political prisoner case a bit more popular than other cases such as worker movement or the indigenous movement. And the Brazilian struggle kind of responds to that quite directly. I've highlighted here in the third picture. This is actually a Brazilian group that's produced this. And it's a committee in solidarity with political prisoners in Brazil. And they responded directly to this, the Russell Tribunal document. They quoted it. So you can see there's actually a direct connection between the two. And I mean, I guess this goes with what we were talking about earlier about how we haven't really discovered anything new here. We still have the same people are being accused of human rights violations. The same victims' names are popping up, but we're seeing something else here, which is this direct communication between the international idea of human rights and how the Brazilians themselves understood it. So I guess the thing I've really taken away from the boxes so far is that there are these three different narratives that have each got their own interpretation of human rights. They each have different connections to the rest, or to the greater international scene, and they each have different strategies for going about their struggles. So that's that really. Thank you.